So to start making this, and it's actually pretty simple. It seems like you guys are either just not following along or you just don't want to bother me while I go through all this. So let's go ahead and go File, Open. I'm going to go ahead and open my Pablo Picasso Girl with Mandolin Fanny Tellier 1910. So that's what the original looks like. Again, right, anytime I start a new Photoshop file, it's going to come in as a background layer is locked. Let me make sure this is recording too. Sorry, forgive me for this. I always got to check myself. So I'd hate to do all this and then it not be recording. So that means I got to do it again. Come on, buddy. Yep, it's recording. Okay, mucho bueno. Anyways, so hopefully you have this open now. Now remember from our last little tutorial set, I'm going to keep my background layer locked. And what I'm going to do is drag this down to duplicate it. And then I'm going to double click and rename that layer as base image. And then another way I can approach using selection tools, right? So I'm always just trying to parse out the pixel data, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to use a filter and also then different color ranges within this. So I will select my base image layer, and then you're going to do this operation a few different times. So I'll do it once, and then I'll do it again, and then I'll let you fly with it, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and select color range. I'll leave that hanging up there for you. Now how this works, and it only works when you have the particular base image layer selected, right? And when I start off, I have nothing, right? So I'm wanting to sample that layer's image data, right? So I'll just drag that off to the side here. And maybe for this case, I want a series of dark values first. So I'll go ahead and select my dark values. Now the fuzziness within this, right? This is controlling the exact color. If I go down to 0, it's only going to select that particular pixel's color value. And on an image that's a painting, right, chances are there's only one pixel with that color value. So what I can do is it'll begin to mitigate what we call a threshold and select more pixels based upon what that initial color value is. Right? So it'll take like a surrounding radius, right? You think of like I go to Google Maps. And in Google Maps, I search for Starbucks. And I'm like zoomed in really far, so I only see one Starbucks. But then I zoom out farther, and that's my threshold. Then I have multiple Starbucks in my Google Maps, right? Kind of that idea. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So that selects a threshold of pixels that are in a darker range since I sampled in a dark value. And then I'm going to create a new layer based on a copy of that selection. So I go to Layer, New Layer via Copy. It's there. That hanging up there for a second for you. Alrighty. And then I'm just going to call that dark values. And then if I turn that off, turn off those bottom two layers, you'll see that it pulled out that pixelization of darker values for me. The next one I want to do is probably like a mid-tone layer. And you can go to your heart's content with how many you want. But for this tutorial, I'm only going to do 3. So I'm going to go back down and make sure that, and this is where people make mistakes, right? So whenever I'm going back to do the same operation, I need to make sure that my base image layer is selected, not the newly created layer. That's why I turned it off. So I'm going to go ahead and select color range. And in this case, I'm going to do the brighter values next. Right, so it does the inverse of those. Now this is where like pseudo randomness comes in, right? So I'm going to decrease the amount of threshold, so I'm only selecting a few of those tonalities. Again, bright is bright. And then again, doing the same operation, layer, with my base image layer selected, layer, new layer via copy. Right, and if I turn that off, right, you can see that particular value set for that one. Everybody good so far? Yeah? Who's not? Okay. Oh, who's like back on like stage 1? I opened the JPEG. Nobody's. So we're beyond that scope. So let me pause this and just make sure that we're all. One last one. I'm gonna do like a mid-tone value on mine. I'm gonna do again layer on, layer selected, select color range. I'm going to do a mid-tone value, which is there. And maybe I want a lot of those. I don't know yet. I'll just do a lot. It turns out different every time I do this. So okay, then I'm going to go ahead and do layer, new layer, via copy. Alright, so I have 1, 2, and 3, and I can turn off my base image. So that's generally what I'm left with. Separation of color. Kind of looks like the graphic still, kind of doesn't look like the graphic still. So I'm going to pause again for a minute, let you catch up to where I'm at. You should have at least 3. I have my 3 layers of color. My base image is off. What I want to do is to get that mosaic effect, right? So I want to begin taking and even further manipulating this color data. So under that filter menu, and you can select just one thing of color. Select, let's do like my most recent one was my midtones, so make sure I rename that one, my midtones. I'm going to turn off my other 2 layers, so I'm only working on a layer at a time. I'm going to go to filter, and then under filter there's this pixelate menu, so you can explore the pixelate. Some of them are fairly cheesy. There's like one that tries to simulate a Voronoi pattern very, very badly. So again, you can't go wrong with boxes. I'm a fan of boxes, man. They work well. So there's this mosaic tool. So go to pixelate, mosaic. And just like I did the color range, right, I'm going to do pseudo randomness with this by changing the cell size of each layer's object. So if I zoom out, right, and I zoom in, what it's doing is it's taking those colors, that color range, and beginning to kind of make it a squared object. And you know, again, it's like trying to be visually appealing, right? If I go super big with it, right, I'm going to end up with something like that, right, which just takes all my squares. So that's one way to approach it. Another way to approach this is to say, okay, well, I'm going to come backwards with it and say I'm going to do a bunch of little tiny ones with the other one. Now, me looking at it, because I've done this, you know, like 10 or 20 times now, I know that right there is pretty darn good for what I want. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK for that one. That was a cell size of 38. And then I'm going to do it to the next layer, right? So I'm going to go to the next layer, which was my highlight layer. And I'm going to do that same filter, but to simulate pseudo randomness, I'm going to make it either bigger or smaller on that pixelization. So I'm going to go ahead and pixelate, do a mosaic again, and then within that I'm going to make that larger or smaller. Probably make it a little bit larger. Okay. And then finally, then the dark values, I'll do the same thing, and maybe I'll make those the little tiny ones. So filter, pixelate, mosaic. I'll leave that up for a second so you can see it. And I'm just going to make them tinier there. Okay. So as it bleeds in, you know, darkness, there's not a lot of dark, so I make those the tinier ones. You can invert that relationship if you want. Okay, so then if I turn on my base image, my midtones, my highlights, and my dark values, right, just starting there, I've now just kind of just bled out everything that I had going for this image, right? So the last part is to create depth out of that. I want, when I looked at that painting, it still had this level of depth to it. You know, it was a painting, it was an oil painting at one time. So to bring depth back to this image manipulation, excuse me, is I can then, one last way to blend things is to, instead of double clicking on the text per layer, go to my midtones, I'm going to double click on the just blank space to the right of the text. And what that does is it should bring up this layer style menu. And there's all kinds of layer styles you can work with. For our particular case, I just want to begin lifting it off the page. So I do a bevel and emboss. Now, just checking this does not mean that I'm working in the editing mode for bevel and emboss. Just like I select layers, I need to make sure I select bevel and emboss. So then that should be highlighted. And you'll see that I get a different set of operations. And you can see kind of like down here a little bit, I start to get a little shadow play and highlight play on it, so I can increase my size. Right? So you'll see that it goes really, really big, which is not good. I can soften that or not soften that edge, which I don't want to do either. Again, it's going smooth too, so usually chisel is going to give you a little bit better effect on this. You can play around with it. I had to play around with this for a little while before I decided to do this as a tutorial many years ago. We'll go ahead and do a depth value, so the depth is going to increase, the size is going to increase, right? Start bringing that out. I want to soften that. Right. And make sure contour is checked. So if I look at contour, if I want to anti-alias or not. When I do the contour, it starts to really finely kind of bring things in and out on the drawing. Don't use texture. It doesn't ever quite work very well. Right. My range of chiseling on the contour, right? So if I bring that all the way down, that's when I get the, on the contour, that's when I get like the really, really pronounced effect on there. And so kind of just start playing with it. You don't want it so thick. Again, subtlety on that. Click OK. So that takes like the transparency values and then applies that mosaic depth to that object. Go ahead and do the same thing to your dark values and highlights. Pseudo randomness again, kind of just eyeballing it as you go. And it should, make sure you check chisel hard again. And you can play around with it. Some of them you go deeper or not deeper with it, so those I want to go deeper with. Increase the size of them. No softening. Contour depth, right? So I can start bringing out the larger pixels on that. And then the last one is the dark values. And we'll go to do the same thing. Repetition, never a bad thing. Size, we don't want on the little ones, we don't want it too big on there. No softening. I can change the angle, you know, try changing the gloss values and turning that if you want. Right, when I did that, it really went a different way. Oops. And then I can begin thinking about, do I want to place this above or below in the layer stacks, right? If I want to, because what happens is when I do my layers, I end up with this effects, bevel, and emboss. I can just pull that up, and I can go drag that down. So you'll see how that begins to change the effect if I bring my dark values first versus my light values, or bring my midtones up. How do I want to mitigate all that too? So typically dark, mid, light for it. You know, and you can go a variety of things, right? We've learned a blending layer. right? I can change my opacities of this so I get more of the base image blending out versus the non-base image, right? So it's really a matter of what do I want to get out of what I'm trying to do. In this case, it's pretty close to what I was looking to do. Again, you can also play with like the filters on this, right? Do I want to do a difference with it? I can do a pin light, linear light, it'll brighten that. Excuse me. Luminosity, right? So each one kind of does different things for you. Make sense?